channel. My name is Michelle, and around here we talk about 18th century history and books and writing books. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about something that I'm exploring in my creative project. I'm looking at the relationship between an enslaved woman and the woman who owned her. In the 18th century, women did indeed participate in the slave economy. They bought and sold people. They punished people. They went after people who tried to self-emancipate. Women were active in this practice. And I want to take a look at what that relationship would have been like between a woman who was enslaved and a woman who owned her. We're going to talk about that a little today, and we're going to start by looking at a woman named Ona Judge. She was an enslaved woman owned by George and Martha Washington, and she self-emancipated. The Washingtons went after her. They worked really hard to get her back. So let's start with her story.
Ona Judge was the daughter of Betty, one of Martha Washington's dower slaves, and Andrew Judge, an English-born white man who was indentured by George Washington. Ona would become Martha Washington's lady's maid, which means she would have helped Mrs. Washington dress each morning. She would have styled her hair, maintained her clothes and jewelry, and taken on any household task her mistress would have required. As Mrs. Washington's personal maid, Ona would have traveled extensively and would have shared spaces with prominent revolutionaries and leaders in the early American Republic. Mrs. Washington would have ensured that Ona conducted herself with poise and grace. Ona's clothes would have been of higher quality than that of most enslaved workers, and she would have kept them in excellent condition. Ona was a reflection of Martha Washington's status, and Martha had exacting expectations. Eventually, Ona would be passed down to Martha's heirs, and it may have been this knowledge that incentivized her to find a way out.
Women did enslave other women and men and children, and they did this on their own, not always through the representation of another man in their life, so a husband or a male relative. These women were savvy businesswomen participating in an evil trade. Sometimes they came to it because they inherited enslaved people. Sometimes they came to it because they were gifted enslaved people. But they stayed in this business and they understood their legal rights and legal responsibilities.
When George and Martha Washington moved to Philadelphia for the president's first term in office, Ona went with them. While in Philadelphia, the Washingtons would have provided her with a little spending money and a bit of time for social entertainment. It was perhaps through these excursions that Ona found herself immersed in the large free black communities and Quaker abolitionist circles that flourished in Philadelphia. The Washingtons, meanwhile, found themselves frustrated by the Gradual Emancipation Act of 1780, which provided a path to freedom for people born into slavery. The new president couldn't keep his enslaved workers with him in Philadelphia longer than 6 months, or they would qualify for emancipation. Washington's secretary Tobias Lear recommended that Washington rotate his enslaved workers between Mount Vernon and Philadelphia. Washington agreed, but wrote to Lear, "I request that these sentiments and this advice may be known to none but yourself and Mrs. Washington." And it was through this very practice that Ona Judge was able to self-emancipate. Ona would recall, "While they were packing up to go to Virginia, I was packing to go. I didn't know where, for I knew that if I went back to Virginia, I should never get my liberty."
Martha Washington would claim that she was shocked that Ona Judge left. She claimed that they treated Ona like family, and a lot of women slaveholders would say this, but it wasn't really true. They might make sure that their enslaved workers were well clothed or well fed. this wasn't out of any sort of compassion for these people. It was simply to make sure that they could get their jobs done. It was widely held that an effective slave owner didn't need to use violence or cruelty to have their enslaved workers do their jobs. But there were still very cruel enslavers, and sometimes women were those people as well. They would beat their enslaved workers, they would whip their enslaved workers, they would starve their enslaved workers. But it wasn't always those big examples of violence that we see. They also used microaggressions in some very calculated ways, things that you might not see, but were happening very much so. So stabbing an enslaved maid with a sewing needle, or accidentally pressing an enslaved woman's hand against a hot kettle. These were the types of violence that some women enslavers used against the people that they owned.
Ona escaped to New Hampshire. The Washingtons worked diligently to try to get her back. They advertised a monetary reward for her capture and return, and they called upon Joseph Whipple, Portsmouth's customs collector, to retrieve her. But he was a secret abolitionist, so he warned her instead of capturing her. The Washingtons also enlisted the help of Martha's cousin, Burwell Bassett Jr., who thankfully disclosed his mission to Senator John Langdon. Langdon distracted Bassett with some fine hospitality while dispatching a messenger to alert Ona to the danger. Eventually, Ona would marry Jack Staines, a seaman, and together they would have 3 children. In 1845 and 1846, Ona gave interviews to abolitionist newspapers in which she criticized the Washingtons for their lack of piety and their penchant for parties, drinking, and card playing, especially on Sundays. She also denied Martha Washington's claim that she had been treated with special care by the Washingtons.
Ona Judge Staines died on February 25th, 1848. She was a free woman. If you want to learn a little bit more about Ona Judge, I recommend Erica Dunbar's book, Never Caught. And that book was really helpful for me as I was putting together this information. And if you want to know a little bit more about women enslavers, particularly in the 19th century, Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, They Were Her Property, examines that in detail. And I'm going to include links to those books in the description box below. I'll also include a link to an article that I wrote on this topic, and maybe a little bit of creative writing around it as well. As always, thank you so much for getting nerdy with me, and I will see you in the next video.